Hi, everyone, and welcome to Founder Friday. This is where we sit down with some of the best founders in the Microsoft for Startups community. We learn about what they're doing, why it matters, and share actionable insights for all of you, the rest of our founders. Today, I am incredibly excited to bring one of my favorite startups that's been a part of some of our most strategic programs. Please welcome Alex Ratner, the CEO and co-founder of Snorkel AI. Alex, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited for the chat today.
Of course. And same, Alex, one of the one of the biggest reasons why I've been excited for this conversation is Snorkel is one of the best success stories, both of a truly AI native startup that was super relevant in the traditional AI ML world, where we were still hand labeling models. And then now in the Gen AI world, where we're talking about agents, we're talking about scaling AI to production, you've been incredibly relevant throughout the way. And then the other thesis, your story as a technical founder, and we have a lot of them in our Microsoft for Startups community, both a founder that is technical, that has scaled with such great commercial success, is awesome. And we want to hear more of that. So let's start with, for anyone who doesn't know Snorkel, Alex, could you just introduce them to who you are and what y'all do?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the kind words. And in turn, I was not paid to say this at all, but Microsoft for Startups has been just such a wonderful program, and has really spanned multiple different almost iterations of the company, along with the AI space changing so dynamically over the last 6 years or maybe 4 or 5 years that we've been partnered. So we're incredibly grateful for that program. That is part of how the journey actually successfully happened from technical, academic to company founder with that help. So just want to thank you for that. But yeah, quick intro to Snorkel. We call ourselves an AI data research lab now. Remember when we started, it was the goal was to sound more enterprise grade, and those of us who came from an actual research lab, our co-founder and a bunch of us were over at Stanford, and I had a lab at University of Washington where I was full-time as a faculty member. The main marching order was, sound more enterprisey, hide the fact that you came from a research lab. And now, research labs are
back
as fundable entities. So we are once again unabashedly a research lab. We work on AI data development. So how do you generate, curate, label data, and now when we say data, this often includes a complex environment. It includes complex tasks and rubrics for coding agents and enterprise agents and other things like that. But all of this we refer to as data development, and we build technology for accelerating and improving the quality and precision of data development for building data sets to evaluate, to train, to tune, to do reinforcement learning, and basically to advance AI, both the big general models. We work with nearly all the major frontier labs, neo labs, as well as vertical specific models and enterprise specific models and agents. So all of the data that goes into evaluating and tuning those models is the critical fuel, and increasingly those agents. We work on technology to develop that, and then we directly now provide a lot of that data.
And this is such a journey. And so I'd love to maybe start with the earliest days. So could you start with the origin story? What was that moment where you realized, okay, we're facing all these different problems in the data side, and that you and your co-founder wanted to solve this problem?
We started almost a decade and a half ago over at Stanford. One of our co-founders, a professor there still. A bunch of us were in the lab. Some of us then went and started labs elsewhere. I was at University of Washington for a bit. And at the time, data was really viewed as this kind of, upstream janitorial thing that was not within the purview of someone working in AI. I literally remember when we were starting to kind of think this was an interesting direction to kind of look into, how were people hacking together data sets? How were they cleaning them? How were they accelerating them? What could be formalized in terms of theory and systems and workflows, which is what we did as kind of AI systems builders and also on the theory side. I literally remember one of my closest friends who now actually works at one of the major model labs, and is probably part of some of the largest human data consumption in history, uh, um, saying, as one of my closest friends, like, "Are you sure you want to work on data? You're never going to publish. It's an AI lab. That's not, that seems risky." And luckily, I had the support of my advisor Chris Ray at the time of saying, "No, let's stay the course." Um, you know, uh, we were just, we had a rule in the lab about, and I kept this in my lab, and I've tried to propagate this into the company with a very kind of forward deployed engineer centric culture and mo, that we always had a rule of being, you know, uh, involved with several real deployments, with customers. This time, we did were open source academic collaborators at the medical school, or a lab or something, but always had our hands dirty with real customers, deployments, real customers or users, even if it was a theory project. And that was kind of in some ways our saving grace, because every time we were just sitting in a lab, we were coming up with all these fancy, new machine learning algorithms, et cetera. Then we went to go pitch them to users, and they said, "Okay, that sounds great, but you said I have to label all this data for that. How can you help me with that? Because I can't label 20,000 X-rays or 1,000 documents. Can you help with that?" And we would say, that's not AI. You figure that out. Until we realized, okay, this is actually the number one problem in practically evaluating, training, tuning AI. So I'd say, even though at the time no one in an AI lab cared about data, no curriculum anywhere talked about data prep as part of AI, we had this confidence coming from users. And I'd say this is one of my most important tips I've given on the research side as an advisor, and I think it's also on the startup side. One of the most important is you get your learnings from real end-to-end engagements with users or customers, and being very deeply involved, even if that seems less scalable at first. So that was kind of our anchor point. We saw that data was this bottleneck to all of the fancy AI machinery. This was when deep learning was becoming a thing, and we kind of saw that if deep learning began to scale up, and we never imagined it would scale up as rapidly or significantly as it has with LLMs, but we saw the basic principle that as these deep learning models were going to scale up, the models were going to become much more powerful, but also much more standardized, much more black box. And we really thought that as this happened, and the same thing with the algorithms, as people were converging, pun not intended, on a couple of core algorithms, we really thought that the interface to AI was really going to shift to the data. The data already this kind of very underappreciated but massive bottleneck to real AI and real deployment settings, but that it was actually going to become the epicenter of how you actually evaluated and developed AI. So we thought, hey, this is a cool research thesis. We found resonance on pain points around data with customers. So we started working on how do we actually formalize this with systems, with workflows, with statistical theory. How do we use that to accelerate it so we could make an expert labeler, a doctor, a lawyer who maybe had only a few minutes to spare, 10 to 100 times more efficient, as well as higher quality at generating and curating and labeling data. And then, that became, this open source project. There were tons of companies, major tech orgs, consulting firms, enterprises using it, making literally billions of dollars. I won't name names who, but, direct to bottom line off of the technology. We still stuck to academia because we thought it was just so exciting as a place to learn and build. But at some point, we realized this was really a pretty major product surface area, and we really needed to productize it. And that's not, academia is not the vehicle for that. So that was when we spun out and started working as a company. So sorry for the long-winded overview, but that's a little bit on the history.
And so much to unpack there. I want to go into the product journey, but you spoke about how you were working with users throughout the way. So maybe the first thing I want to unpack is, could you walk us through how your journey of getting to those, let's say, first 10 users, including the first few enterprise users, because of a lot of our founders want to sell to enterprises and are just starting out.
Yeah. There was a version of this journey on the academic side, although, a lot of that was way easier, kind of working as a a well-funded project outside in the Stanford AI Lab. We kind of had it easy at first. So I'll really talk about the harder version of it, which is when we spun out the company, getting those first couple of customers. And, we started off, we've been, for the entirety of the company, we've been building a platform for data development. So generating, curating, labeling data with an expert human in the loop, but automating and accelerating to make them faster and more efficient and higher quality. Today, we use this to power, data set development for nearly all of the major frontier labs and vertical AI developers, neo labs, leading enterprises. When we started, though, we were just selling, an initial version of the platform to enterprise customers. So it was very kind of strat enterprise focused. One strategy we took that was not in vogue at the time, even though now it's very much in vogue, was we took a very FDE centric approach, where myself and the co-founding group were the FDE. One of our first customers was a top 3 U.S. bank that is still a customer today, and I literally had a $0 contractor arrangement and a Alex Ratner at this bank email address in the beginning. And this was very much against the grain of the time. I mean, our board, our investors who have been wonderful, were all supportive. But everyone was very focused on scalability and kind of PLG motions, and we loved open source. We loved that prospect, but we really thought that to get to the customers and the learnings that we needed to go to the largest companies that had the most unique data sets and the real AI maturity. And so, and the way to get those learnings and to actually earn the right to get those contracts with these massive enterprises as a tiny startup really was by leaning in with our team. And I think that's something that founders in the enterprise space a year or two ago, I'd say they massively underappreciate. Now, thanks to, Palantir's stock and other waves, FDE is and everyone is excited about the FDE motion again, but I still think people underappreciate, this is number one, and most importantly, your most important and highest alpha vector for learning as a company is to put initially yourselves as co-founders, then as you build a team, the smartest people that you can find and convince to be, at least 50% of their time, customer deployment, footing in the field, and then to bring back the non-proprietary learnings about how do you improve your product. Those are the learnings that no one else is going to have because you're in a place where most companies are not. So learning, A, that's the most important thing. And then B, it's also how you earn your way in. If you think about it from an enterprise buyer's perspective, they don't want to go through what for an enterprise, even in today's era of excitement around AI, might be a 9+ month, engagement and procurement cycle for something that might not work. They might not get any value out of. But if they look at your team and say, hey, here are some scrappy people who are going to be hell-bent between their product and their team, who, by the way, is an awesome team that I would love to get free labor out of. They're going to make sure this works. That's what gets you in the door with enterprises who, as an early, pre-seed company, you'd otherwise have no business kind of getting in the door with. So I'm a big believer in this motion. The other piece of advice we got was to charge for engagements. This was, it felt very awkward at first to kind of like demand a fee that at the time was like more money than I'd ever heard of as a longtime grad student. But it's a powerful filter. I'm a big believer. It's actually more important for startups, the handful that I still advise, like to charge up front, because later on you'll have a more sophisticated pre-sale sales team. They'll do the groundwork to figure out, is this a real opportunity or just someone kicking the tires in an innovation lab? Then you can drop the price because it won't matter. But in the beginning, when you have the bandwidth as a pre-seed or seed stage startup to maybe do a handful of POVs and lean in, and then that's your shot, and they're either successful or you're dead, you really want to filter for the teams that have real budget, real business value on the line, real commitment to partnership. And so I think those basic principles of like get forward deployed, do it for learning, but also do it as a way to guarantee value realization acknowledging you're a small startup and this is a big enterprise customer, and make sure that you filter for seriousness, even if that means turning down some shiny logos who would be happy to work with you for free. That sounds super basic, but I think that was really what kind of helped us get started.
Yes, and I think especially that part where you had so much conviction, where you escaped zero cost pilots early on, is something that I endorse as well. And it's great to hear that from you. But it's really about how when you were on site, you made sure that you were feeding those continuous learnings and funneling that back to your product. So I'd love to know, because you were always building an enterprise platform, and enterprise data, you were working across industries, every customer has different data, it is messy. What were some of those learnings, or particularly like how did you make sure that you incorporated some of those themes and built a platform that worked across enterprises and their unique challenges?
It's always a challenge. I mean, the diversity of where and how enterprise data is stored and how you access it and how you run compute intensive jobs over it and how you get those platforms in the door and installed and deployed is still something that we're that I think everyone struggles with. And it's part of why people talk about the crazy rate of AI progress today. But there's still a diffusion, a pretty slow diffusion rate for this is one of the major reasons. It also leads to the moat around enterprise data, and anyone who can kind of be part of the value chain of getting it into AI, which is where we were aimed. So I think we knew from the get-go that it was going to be this very expensive and technically challenging investment. Part of it was just acknowledging that and saying, okay, we're going to understand that a big chunk of our R&D team, even though we're funded as an AI company, is going to be really about enterprise deployment, data access, et cetera. Obviously, partnerships with the major providers that enterprises use is a major accelerant there. Hence, why we were so keen to partner with Microsoft, for example, and get help there even before we had the business maturity to understand what would a channel partner or like a mature go-to-market partnership look like. We knew that we wanted to, if we could, and we were lucky enough to get your help, kind of get partnership there, just so we could get started at that level. Yeah, and I think it continues to be something that I think most AI startups underinvest in and underappreciate the complexity of.
Absolutely. And you mentioned how enterprise data is actually a moat. I want to maybe switch to another related topic that's top of mind for our founders. It is building a moat as an AI company today. What would you say is Snorkel's moat? And then how should our founders think about moats for their companies?
Yeah, it's a very top of mind question, given what's been going on in the public markets around SaaS today. I think that a lot of people have been talking about the question of SaaS moats. I'll start I guess on Snorkel, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about more broadly for AI companies. But our view, I guess Snorkel and any company that's working in the data space, and we started very much focused on enterprises and really complex, expert in the loop, high expertise kind of data development workloads there. As the frontier models have begun to focus on more complex, expert agentic tasks that are way harder than simple kind of crowd working tasks where a lot of the data industry got started, we've also shifted there. And now, a lot of our work and a lot of our crazy growth recently has been serving, nearly all the major foundation model labs and folks like that. And so I'll focus on that for a bit. I think the enterprise segment is, going to be bigger, but a little bit slower, obviously. And so, one big chunk of our business is selling data to, model developers, general models, vertical specific, models or AI products. By definition, we are paid to produce data that is both super high quality, but also challenging for the models and kind of pushing the frontier. Mm-hmm. So for us, the whole value of what we do is that between our technology and human experts that we work with and source as contractors, we are producing the kind of data that the models can't produce and struggle on. So I think a lot of the, kind of moat fears of, well, what we're doing, why can't the model just produce that? Literally the data we produce is exactly the set of data almost entirely that models can't produce. Otherwise it wouldn't, in fact, like by default be of value. So, our our output is kind of exactly in the complementary set of what models can produce. That's part of,
Right.
why, you know, in terms of like, could the data we produce be automated? Well, if it could, then we wouldn't be able to sell it to most of our customers. So there's that. I think one of the other, sources of moat is, not just the technology we've developed over the last decade and a half, the research, the technology, et cetera, about how to do this kind of human expert in the loop, but AI accelerated data development. But it's specifically the aspect that involves these complex, human and AI interfaces. I think people are worried a lot about the durability. I think for fair reason of kind of anything that's just purely an AI model. Certainly it's a tough world to be in if you're building an AI model, to compete with everyone else who's building AI models. But I think anything that intersects with, real world complexity, people talk about, atoms and physical world interfaces, but this goes with humans as well. I think that is less easy to improve on because it's messy and signal acquisition is slower. Like figuring out the right way to work with hundreds of thousands of experts on super complex tasks that the models themselves can't produce or answer yet is a really expensive thing to run, and it takes lots of real world interactions to learn the way to optimize it. Versus if it was something that was entirely digital, it's a little bit easier to advance more rapidly than ever before, and someone else can attach up and replace it. So that's kind of how I think about Snorkel's moat. Is it's number one, the core technology, but not just the AI parts of it, which we're very proud of and have worked on, far before anyone else and for longer than anyone else, and have a unique perspective there. But it's the fact that it interfaces with the messiness of the real world and
Yes.
the expert humans and human in the loop processes that we have to optimize and learn about is not that easy to learn about or replicate overnight. And then it's the fact that we specifically, chart our data roadmap, our product roadmap, our business in the white space of what models can't yet do.
Exactly. Yeah.
That also feeds into the moat, which is kind of just like how we have to run our business, at least the part that sells to frontier labs.
And if I think about just this entire theme, I think this is where, to your point, like you've always been grounded in the real problems. So whether it was that traditional AI/ML world or now with the agentic world, can you walk us through the ChatGPT moment where you spoke about how you're currently working with the frontier labs, you're working on really complex, helping them on agentic workflows. Like, how did you navigate the transition from the previous world to this new world that we're in?
It was a fun time. And by fun I mean not fun. It was very exciting. As someone who's worked in AI for more than a minute, it was one of the most exciting times to be an AI researcher and builder, to see that kind of inflection point. And we can argue about what else since then has been ChatGPT level, but arguably like there have been multiple of those kind of moments that have come across the last couple of years and across Snorkel's history. So it was exhilarating. And our fundamental conviction that data is a robust and will always be a robust need of evaluation and tuning and development of AI models kind of gave us confidence that this would only increase the net need for what we did. That was great. But it did massively disrupt, both the kinds of products the kinds of use cases we were focused on at the time, as well as the enterprise buying cycle. I mean, when ChatGPT came out, it kind of raised the baseline of a whole set of tasks right away. And when you're running kind of a go-to-market process as an AI company, at least enterprise focused, I'm not saying everyone will do it this way, but generally speaking, the sweet spot for doing a pilot is a problem that is complex enough that you are uniquely able to solve it versus, like right now, any startup that's selling into an enterprise as an AI lab company, whatever, you need to show your value on something that is harder than what can just be accomplished by like opening ChatGPT, right? But you obviously don't want it to be a massive, year-long, pathologically difficult project. So the sweet spot, in my opinion, of selling to the enterprise as an AI company, whether you're selling the platform, whether you're selling, solutions and services, whatever it might be, is that like hard enough to show differentiated value, but not too hard to make the POV drag on forever. Think about that, like the kinds of use cases that we were doing POVs around, the waterline went up. And a lot of those became, doable with a prompt. And of course, we could adjust and just work on the next harder problems, but it did, that was disruptive around what we were building, what kinds of use cases we were building for. It was a big product shift that we had to undergo that took some time from kind of, we call predictive like labeling tasks to generative tasks. And then soon after to agentic tasks, which was obviously super exciting, but obviously, we weren't tiny at the time. And so steering the ship always takes some patience and some doing. And then I think also it was just very disruptive for, at least for us, and I've heard this mirrored from many at the time, because, AI teams and data science teams, their heads were spinning.
Right.
They naturally wanted, like we had a lot of POVs kind of pump the brakes and say, hey, we believe that we're going to need data, but first we've got to see what we can do with just basic prompting. Like we have to POV ChatGPT first and deliver a report to our boss's boss's boss ASAP, or else we're all fired. So like, sorry, that's cutting the line before we get back to you guys. So it was a moment where we had this immense excitement and conviction that, maybe the advances in LLMs would remove some need for certain types of the data, the labeled training data that we were building. But in the net way that it was going to, expand AI usage, it was going to be a massive net positive for us and for anyone in AI data. But in the near term, it was a couple of quarters where things, flatlined and then had to kind of be pivoted to new use cases, which is a whole layer of our stack, kind of wading through all this enterprise buyer chaos. So it was quite a moment. And we were lucky to have, the support of our board of partners like Microsoft for Startups that, also kind of had the vision to say, hey, what you're doing is going to be bigger than ever once we get through this transitionary churn in the enterprise space, who stood by us and helped us navigate that period.
Yes, and you spoke about a variety of different challenges. So I'd love for you to share with our founders. We're now in like sort of mid 2026. What are the top 3 enterprise AI challenges you're still seeing and passionate about solving?
I guess our biggest segment by volume, are frontier labs, enterprises who are tuning and developing their own models, neo labs, vertical AI startups who, we use our technology internally and we develop data and environments for them and with them. And I'd say, I'll start there. I'd say, top of mind is really, it's quality, it's complexity, and it's partnership. So I think quality kind of speaks for itself, although people often, some of our research actually with some folks at Microsoft and some of the folks on the academic side that we published from the lab side from Stanford, UW, and elsewhere. One of my students led a lot of this work. Was actually most recently on how the distribution of the data matters. So like when you build data sets, maybe this is getting too in the weeds, but it's not just about, is this coding agent task, or is this, legal example, is it correct and high quality? It's also, what is the distribution? Is it, matching the kinds of user patterns you'd expect in the real world? If you dump in a bunch of data that is correct, but it's like, for some kind of coding task that is totally different than what you want your coding agent to actually be good at, you're not going to get a good outcome. That sounds super intuitive, but it's kind of like, it's still underappreciated in terms of how folks build data sets. Complexity is top of mind for folks in this space, is getting data that is complex enough to stump the model, so it's useful for evaluation, for tuning, but not so complex that it's esoteric. You can make something pathologically difficult, a coding task, a trivia question, a math problem, still such that models will fail 100% of the time. It's actually easier than building a problem that is both realistic and difficult. Like it's actually a coding task someone will do in the wild, but it stumps the coding agents, or vice versa for any other area we service. And then I'd say partnership. Whether it's a lab or who's leading the frontier, or a new team in an enterprise who are getting started, I think people are under such pressure for value and such time pressure, and there's so much change going on, that I think any vendor, especially a startup where you have to really over deliver to earn your spot, that's not acting as a partner, ideally with an informed research perspective of some kind, is not going to kind of get to the top. So I think those are kind of the big emphases on enterprises, where we're both providing the data, but we're also helping with the broader solution of eval and tuning. I'd say that those things are all important, but the real thing is it's just value realization. That sounds so trite to say, but people are there's never been more funding in enterprise AI, but people are also losing patience with, paying for these big constellations of tools that get installed and pieced together, but don't actually get a line of business sponsored project across the line, especially as a lot of those tools get absorbed into the model layer, become, obfuscated by advancements, et cetera. So I think the tolerance for paying for things that don't immediately or very soon translate to business value, to an actual use case. Today, it's often an agent that is deployed into production in a high value setting that's actually unique and differentiated for that enterprise. The patience has gone way down. And so I think, this is some of why, per the earlier part of the conversation, you see more excitement about FTEs, because I think that's one of the pieces that's required to get that rapid value realization. But people have always said this, but I think the tolerance for something that doesn't connect to, line of business level value is lower than it ever has been in the enterprise. And so that's the additional thing that I would add for kind of enterprise teams versus, frontier labs.
That's true. That's absolutely the theme we're seeing as well. So it really resonates. You spoke about our partnership a few times. So I'd love to have the rest of the founders in the Microsoft for Startups community hear about how the Microsoft for Startups program helped you on your journey, whether you were building, scaling, selling, across the board.
In so many different ways. And so, I think there's obviously a lot of generous support that you all have offered over the years as kind of part of the, the different programs that we got to be part of, which was incredible. And so I think that, from kind of partnership with figuring stuff out on the deployment side, on the enterprise side, credits, compute assistance, et cetera. All of that is obviously we've been incredibly grateful for that. Some other things to call out though is some of the access that we got to Microsoft leadership and honestly I'm not someone who I've gotten to meet a lot of really cool people in the AI space, and I always enjoy it, but I wouldn't always say it's needle moving. But some of the meetings with Microsoft leadership that Microsoft for Startups kind of set up, or some of the sessions we got to be part of, honestly kind of validated some of our perspectives or gave us critical information for moments of great change. Actually, like that ChatGPT moment, we got to hear from some of the leaders at Microsoft that they were very much thinking about data and fine tuning and everything like that, which gave us a lot of guidance and validation of how to align our thesis. A lot of the enterprise specific, kind of everything from architecture of how to, deploy the platform, again, where many startups of any kind, especially AI startups, are traditionally weaker. Getting that support and partnership was critical, along with AI, partnership on the frontier, and then go to market partnership and guidance, and that kind of ramp with our maturity in that area has been incredible. So that's just a couple of things on top of mind.
Absolutely. And you were one of the first startups in our Pegasus program. So you helped us battle test it. So we learned a lot together. Alex, I know you have to jump. So I'll just wrap it up by saying thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sharing not only your insights and your experiences, but sharing them so candidly and providing actionable insights for the rest of the founders. Where can folks connect with you and learn more about Snorkel?
I'm Alex at Snorkel AI. Can reach out anytime. And I'll make a very shameless plug in the last minute here for another way to reach out with the Snorkel team. Just launched an open benchmarks grant to kind of provide funding, scaled data services, and research partnership to any team that's working on open public benchmarks to measure the performance of where AI is working and not working, and kind of chart new directions. And briefly, I'll say on that benchmarks sometimes get way too much focus, and that everyone obsesses over competing on them. Then they get a backlash of people benchmaxing or overfitting to the benchmarks.
Yeah.
Our view, I'd say, is a little bit more sober. They're only one tool of many, including forward deployment, private evals, so many other things to form a real picture of how models are performing. But they are a really important kind of guidepost to kind of set new directions of progress. A new benchmark comes out often for a tiny academic or open source team, and it redirects the focus of the entire frontier. So we're really excited to be supporting teams who are working on those benchmarks that give us more transparency and novel direction, as well as good measurement of AI progress. And if anyone here is working on something that sounds relevant, either as a startup or academically, that's another way to contact us and get some funding and support.
That sounds great. And we'll just drop the link to this in the chat for all of you to get involved. And folks, thank you for tuning in to this week's Founder Friday, and we will see you all next time. Thank you. And thanks, Alex, again.
Thank you so much.